what was the majority willing to sacrifice to retain a united India? That is the question. And it's my argument that, frankly, a lot of the Hindu elite were not unhappy with Pakistan. I mean, of course, there's Aisha Jalal and so on. She has done a considerable amount of scholarship on that. But also an earlier slim volume by H.M. Sirvai. He examines the issue of thing, and he comes to the conclusion that it was actually Congress that wanted partition.
Of course, it's a very complex thing, but broadly speaking, there were few that had more power to decide in terms of their organizational capacity than others. There were views across the board. So who do you think is really responsible?
A lot of the Hindu right were very happy that the Muslims were being removed. I mean, they were quite honest about it. I mean, there's even, I think, recently a book. The title of the book is The Benefit Jinnah Brought to the Hindus.
You know, how do you see that the Muslim problem emerged in India as a byproduct of both Muslim, Hindu right and the Muslim, feudal elites?
So Jinnah was banking on the cabinet mission plan as the last, because he really had no plan B. I mean, the sad thing about the thing was that Jinnah was a gambler. He was someone who gambled with the community.
And so Gandhi had a different view in terms of secularism. But how do you think the Congress-led secularism, especially Nehru and after that, was compromised?
You know, this talk about secularism necessarily being, good for Muslims. In theory, yes, but in practice, it's never been like that.
So how do you see that the Indian Muslim question today, how should Muslims be taking up that in terms of discourse, in terms of demand, in terms of articulation?
नाउस एक इंडिपेंडेंट थिंक टैंक मीडिया प्लेटफॉर्म है जो माइनॉरिटी और ह्यूमन राइट्स के इश्यूज पर रिसर्च और एविडेंस बेस्ड कॉन्वर्सेशंस को एम्पलीफाई करता है। इसे और मजबूत बनाने के लिए नाउस को सब्सक्राइब करें और सपोर्ट करें।
One of the interesting things that I saw when I went through your book, sir, was the articulation of this anxiety, the articulation of this sadness, the articulation of this unbelonging that the Indian Muslims are feeling, at least from 2014. They've been feeling it much before than this. But after 2014, the myth of the potential of Muslim upliftment completely goes away. And then there are scholars like you and others who, because of coming to this situation, are forced to go back and read what happened and why it happened. And then when they come across all of the literature that is available, they find that it's not just 2014. It's a structural culmination of a long, the way the state, the way the Indian state was conceived and structured at its very origin. But the interesting point is not that it was supposed to be fatalist. There were other options. People were discussing. It is not as if the idea of representation, proportionality, the idea of power, sovereignty, hierarchy, they were not present in the years before the partition. There was the caste movement, there was the class movement, there was the religious communal differences that were articulated. And all of that also went through the Constituent Assembly debates. But what you start with in the book is really interesting to me. You put this question on a philosophical pedestal, on a structural level, in which you talk about liberty and equality. So to say, these seem like very intertwined terminologies, that liberty would lead to equality and equality is embedded within the liberal order, within the order where choice is maximized. That is, so to speak, the politics of the terminology and how these can be perceived. And you begin with it by putting these debates between liberty and equality to the forefront and locating all of the structural issues that Indian Muslims faced later on after the partition as a result of this choice that was made at the very beginning of what India is supposed to be. First and foremost, sir, I would like to understand this difference that you've articulated. What does that mean? And how does that change the potential future of any polity or any society and any community in the way that it was going to organize itself as a policy making state?
Well, essentially, the position is that I use the dichotomy between liberty and equality to basically trace or identify a major issue which had been, I mean, discussed earlier, in the 1930s and so on, when there was the prospect of India achieving independence. And the question was whether whether the future India would be a unitary state, would it be a federal state, and there would be, and of course there was the question of how the minorities would be treated, and to that extent there were dialogues, certainly in the 30s, between Jinnah and the Nehrus, for example, which led ultimately to the Nehru report. And the point was that Jinnah was conscious. I mean, Jinnah was a congressman at that stage. He was quite a novel product because he wasn't from the UP heartland. He was a Bombay barrister, and he was, very westernized in his thinking. But the point is that despite the westernization, which he shared with, in that sense, also with Pandit Nehru and so on, he was conscious of communalism and and he had this fear and a sense that, look, that his community should be in some respects protected, that there has to be some degree whereby there would be some leverage, there would be some degree whether the majority cannot, as it were, trespass upon certain rights. Now the thing is that in a sense this position, I mean, was to some extent entrenched in colonial secularism, because you had the system of elections. For example, you had separate electorates and things like that, which, of course, the Congress regarded as part of the divide and rule policy, and this thing. But the point is that whatever that may be, the issue is that the minorities had some level of protection in terms of their representation, because ultimately in a democracy the question of representation is key. And if people vote, and this is where the issue of liberty and equality comes in, because if people have the liberty to vote according to, say, for example, their caste or their community, which unfortunately we're seeing in today's elections. I mean, for example, the present chief minister of UP, Yogi Adityanath, talked about, an election between 80 and 20. Now, 80-20 means what? It means the majority versus the minority. And therefore, the position is that if people decide to vote according to their religion, then, and they have the liberty to do so, because there are no restraints on them. There are no separate electorates. There's no proportional representation. There's no form of any guardrails, basically, which would essentially prevent a majority from this thing, because it's ultimately, and I quote a passage by, I think, Jonathan Lord Sumption, who was the head of the Supreme Court or a judge in the Supreme Court, in the UK Supreme Court, or the English Supreme Court rather, where he talks about, this business of majority being really, it's a thing of numbers. It doesn't give legitimacy. And that is the key to any democratic. You can't have a winner takes all solution, because that's basically what liberty has boiled down to. And I think at that time there were academics and there were people who were, apart from politicians. I mean, people like, for example, Ivor Jennings, who was a great constitutional lawyer, was saying that, look, you can't. It may be difficult in a country which has very is a very multi-religious country, in a sense where caste also plays a role, where there's a great deal of difference. It's a subcontinent. That in that kind of context, things like separate electorates and things like that are not uncommon. In fact, they're very necessary. And the point was that, therefore, the question of equality is really the position that liberty has to be restrained. Liberty has to be restrained when it comes to the matter of representation, because ultimately, when we talk about politics, to acquire any legitimacy has to be a discourse between different people. It has to be the art of the possible. And if you actually have a situation, as you have unfortunately today, where one party, one community have a say over everything, you are now reaching a position where, and of course, I deal in part in also the matter of delimitation, because the issue of delimitation, we have also a problem where people would address delimitation in terms of saying, well, you don't want the majority, the majority rule, one man, one vote. That is the signature. That is the most important thing about a democracy. And of course, the problem is that democracy is much wider than a notion of one man, one vote. And certainly, for example, in India, I mean, we had a situation where Mrs. Gandhi, for good reasons, I think, passed the 42nd Amendment, where you had a freezing of the census from 1971 levels. And the reason that was done was obviously to ensure that you should not reward states which cannot control their populations. And if they cannot control their populations, that issue goes much deeper than merely the question of population control. It leads to things like, for example, education of women and general enhancement of the matters of social indicators, which would basically mean that people who that government is prodded or is directed to consider factors like, for example, literacy, and particularly female literacy, and their involvement in drama. So basically, the point is that it's not simply a question. Now, of course, delimitation raises its own problems. It's distinct from what the issues we faced in the 1940s. But the issues we faced in the 1940s was also something of great concern, because it really went to the heart of whether we were to maintain what I call the glittering prize of a united India. And I think that was a very important thing. And I think that it was something which, frankly, Congress, singularly failed to do. And I mean that, and I think the point is that partition was really, in a sense, I think, certainly for the Muslims, I think it was the worst possible solution. I mean, my Pakistani friends would probably may disagree, but a lot of them actually do agree, because the way Pakistan has developed, as a kind of garrison state, it's been most. But the point about it was that there was a need for some kind of safeguards, and of course, some of those things were debated in the Constituent Assembly, proportional representation and things like that, which has been discussed. But I think critically, the important thing was actually a greater federal structure, because I think the way which I see, and I think that in a sense probably Jinnah also saw, was that the answer to the kind of Hindu communal threat was really a greater emphasis on regional identities. And if you look at, for example, the two states which were neutered in the partition, neutered in the political sense because they were divided and they were rendered almost toothless, in terms of being able to really, in a political sense, were of course Punjab and Bengal, which broadly speaking were states which
Muslim
which
dominated.
were not very communal or very casteist. And the point was, and they of course were slightly, they had a slight Muslim majority. That was it. But the point about those states were that had we had that thing, we could have had, for one thing, I think a greater sort of federal structure, a federal sense of and a sense where a lot of this poison of which has emanated from the cow belt, would essentially have been to some extent diluted.
So, we are going to take up these questions of federalism,
Yes, of
communalism,
course.
cow belt in much detail later. The one of the things that, for example, between liberty and equality, and
Yeah.
you mentioned that within the Constituent Assembly debates, there were points wherein all of these things were discussed, and somebody from Congress or other socialist parties would argue that India has, so to say, reservations, so to say, minority rights, and that is because of the fact that equality and between equality and liberty, in certain areas equality was chosen above liberty. But the question that you're raising at the very base is that at what level was liberty privileged over equality, wherein which was mostly responsible for the kind of unequal structure in terms of power and sovereignty, so to speak, would emerge.
Right.
So there is a question of equality which is embedded, for example, for SC/ST rights, for reservations for them, maybe not for Muslims. So
Right.
why did Congress, a socialist party, Nehru as a socialist planning-oriented thinker who recognizes the fact that there is unequal start for others, and they recognize that there has been communal violence in pre-partition era, so it is not as if Pakistan and Bangladesh are divided. Within India, there is a big chunk of Muslims. Why did you think that Congress chose a path wherein it was, in terms of the debates that happened before, in the Constituent Assembly and before that, and that was all Jinnah and Nehru debates, that this is going to happen? So to speak, why do you think that Congress chose that path?
Well, I think the point was that Nehru, largely because he had a great belief in the notion of economic man. It was a kind of Marxian kind of thing that basically, with greater prosperity, and remember when the British left in 47, the situation in India was pretty dire. In terms of just the level, the income level, that we didn't have very much of an industry. They had actually deindustrialized us for over 2 centuries. Things were pretty bad. So he had this notion that, look, if we were to get our sovereignty, we would be able to propel our economy. And of course, he was very highly impressed by, for example, the planning, central planning, which had been taken from the Russian model of the 1930s, and he felt that that if you actually use that form of that kind of economic strategy, you protected industries to start with, you develop some key core infrastructure, steel plants and things like that, dams and so on, and all these things. He felt that somehow, the matter of communal differences will disappear. That he didn't really feel that, he was in that sense. I think I describe him as someone of that sort of liberal of that liberal disposition where you just see the world getting better and better, and that people begin to forget about become a secular society. And he saw that we will become a secular society maybe in 20 years' time, and really people will forget being casteist or being religious and community. They would think of themselves, and they would really aspire to. I mean, it would be a civic form of citizenship. It would not be a religious kind of thing. And he felt and that was it. That was now that would be the most, how should I put it, charitable view. I mean, there could be another view which may be a little more Machiavellian. I'm not sure, but there could be a view that, look, the Congress, the cow belt and the Congress were critical in the sense that this was a relationship which, post independence, would propel Congress not only effectively the only, I describe it as a sort of creating almost a one-party state. That there was, the problem, the spoiler in the United India thing were the Punjab and Bengal things, because they subscribed to different political trajectories. I mean, if you look at the Unionist Party in Punjab at that time, and if you look at the Krisha Project Party in Bengal, you find a very different kind of trajectory. They were, of course, different. They were, completely different in what they aspired to. I mean, one was a landlord party, the other was a peasants' party, but at any rate, the point is they were not Congress. I mean, the Congress, and the Bose brothers and whatever, the Congress didn't have much of a stronghold in Bengal, and it didn't really have much of a stronghold in Punjab. The point is that, and therefore UP was central. UP and Bihar were central to the Congress hegemony. And the reality was that the Congress was very divided in UP. I mean, if you look at it in terms of on cultural lines, I mean, the point is that, people like, for example, Govind Vallabh Pant was very, he was a trade unionist. I mean, he had left. I mean, a lot of the leftists actually were culturally very Hindu. I mean, in the sense that they were not open to the pluralistic thing. The people who championed pluralism tended to be the upper class, say the Kashmiri Brahmins and people like Nehru and Sapru and people like that, who could see the value in could see the value of, for example, Urdu and the cultural and all the cultural benefits and legacies of the Mughals and of the Muslim period. And therefore, the point is that there was a major cultural schism. And the point was that the last thing that Nehru could have afforded to do at that stage was to create a schism in the Congress along those lines. I mean, for example, after the 37 elections, there are these stories of where, nationalist, Muslim nationalist congressmen would go and hear their Hindu counterparts, the Hindu Congress, being very triumphalist about particularly the loss of the League. The League did terribly in the 37 election. And I mean, it was, suggested that the League should actually merge with the Congress. And the point was that triumphalism, in a sense, I think created a lot of problems for, in terms of the social thing. So it's not that Nehru could be said that he was unaware of that. I mean, he was aware of the fact that there were a lot of congressmen who were very keen to impose a kind of, Hindutva light on UP, on, certainly UP as the most as the most significant state at the time because of its cultural legacies, because of its size, and so on. And therefore, the point is that I think that this was something which I think was very good. Now, whether Nehru was actually genuinely um, had a genuine belief in this notion of inevitable secularism of society, or whether he was being Machiavellian and really didn't want a split in the Congress. Um, I mean, I don't know. We'll never know. But the point is that what we can say is that definite that it is really very difficult to believe that the Congress was was that the lot of the leadership of the Congress were unaware of the problems of the concerns of the minorities. And what is clear is certainly post 37, they never really sought to address those concerns. And I think that I think has been, frankly, was a major problem because it was what you call it, the canary in the gold in the coal mine. The thing of what is going to happen, a presentiment of what will happen in the future. There's the sense that look, that at this stage, when we had not got independence, when there was certainly a talk of Pakistan, I mean, became amplified after the Lahore Resolution in 1940. But at that stage, you would imagine that there would be attempts to try to, address those concerns. And unfortunately, at least the Congress, and certainly the Congress in UP, never really attempted to do that. And I think the point was that, and it's my argument that, frankly, a lot of Hindus, a lot of the Hindu elite, were not unhappy with Pakistan. They were actually saying that, look, the question. I quote someone from, I think, Punjab, someone who said that the issue of Jinnah was that Jinnah wanted parity. He wanted that notion that, look, suppose if say the Muslim population was, say, which it was around 25-26% at that time, that if they, for example, had been given a notional 30%, and that 30% would be like a sort of a veto on certain things, which would affect them.
One of the interesting things that you're raising here, because especially post 2014 and before that, after the rise of Hindutva, and after the rise of Hindutva, there has been proliferation of ideological positions on partition itself from the Hindu right.
Yes.
There has been theoretical interventions in terms of who caused the partition. But also
Yes.
this question has been raised from the Muslim side itself. Whether all of these activities, all of these interactions and negotiations that were happening before the 1937, before the 1940, and after that, there was a context to it, and all of these parties involved, the Muslim League, the Hindu Mahasabha, so to speak, which is absent from our discourse, and RSS has taken the position otherwise, which Hindu Mahasabha is the actor who participated in violence and akhadas and cow politics and vigilantism, and that has been erased in, so to say, a way in which the Hindu right history of violence, of communalization has been as if absent as a reason. And so the role of Congress, in which all of these parties were an amalgamation where Hindu elite was present. So in your reading of all of this hodgepodge of ideological positions, in which a demography was imagined post 1881 of being constituted of these visible demographies of communities, in that context, where do you see, because if you argued in the book that there was an option that you for not partitioning, and so to speak, from Congress, that was demanded more along with whatever the demands were coming from Muslim League. So the question in front of you is, who was really responsible? Of course, it's a very complex thing, But broadly speaking, there were few that had more power to decide in terms of their organizational capacity than others. There were views across the board which may be relevant to few, but irrelevant, so to speak, from the perspective of actually the creation of the state. So, who do you think is really
Well,
responsible?
I'll start with one thing which I think is should actually be the important basis of the argument, which we want to, which I think which is the response to your question, which is a very valid question. I start with, I bring up the question, the thing of Sir Stafford Cripps. Cripps was a conversation with S.P. Mukherjee, where Cripps basically said, look, you can't, you have to have some degree of safeguards
Mm.
for a minority in the situation of a thing, and it's for the majority to give. It's not the minority may ask, because remember, the Muslims were not the only minority that even sought some form, or ultimately sought some form of secession. The Sikhs also wanted. See, they were not given. There were princely states, for example, like Travancore, for example. They were not interested in joining the Union. Kashmir, for example, did not want to join the Union. So the point about it is that it's not as if the Muslims were solely the only people who who were looking at the thing. But the point is, the interesting point is this: that it was for the majority to give. It was not for the minority to take.
Mm.
And therefore, the point is that it became a question that, what was the majority willing to sacrifice to retain a united India?
Mm.
That is the question. And I think the point is that in that way, I think the book, which really, in a sense, of course, there's Aisha Jalal and so on. She has done a considerable amount of scholarship on that. But also, frankly, an earlier piece of an earlier slim volume by H.M. Sirvai, which he examines the issue of a thing, and he comes to the conclusion that it was actually, you know, Congress that wanted partition, and that Jinnah wanted to this thing. Because the ultimate issue the issue was on the cabinet mission plan, and that did actually provide a basis whereby safeguards for the minorities. It, of course, meant that you would have a much more federal India. You would not have the kind of unitary structure, sort of quasi-unitary structure you have today. But it was an attempt. Now there were issues the League had with the cabinet mission plan, including, I think, the Northwest Frontier Province, which of course had voted for the Congress in the thing. But those were not, in my view, issues that could be really were really of any which could not have been resolved. I think the point was that Jinnah was banking on the cabinet mission plan as the last, because he really had no plan B. The sad thing about the thing was that Jinnah was a gambler. He was someone who gambled with the community, with his community, and the thing was there was no real plan B until the British came up with the cabinet mission plan, which, frankly, had it been taken, but it was Congress who torpedoed it. And the Congress torpedoed it because of various factors. And the argument I make is that, look, a lot of the Hindu right were very happy that the Muslims were being removed. They were quite honest about it. There's even, I think, recently a book written by some person who's very strongly RSS imbued, kind of, not an academic, but he writes that the title of the book is the benefit Jinnah brought to the Hindus, basically arguing that look,
Mm-hmm.
by asking for partition,
Mm.
that this was the best thing
Yes.
that could happen for the Hindus. So the point is that, but that's something which is not ever really spoken about. I mean, he says it now, many years, decades after this thing. But certainly, there was definitely this undercurrent in the Hindu right that we are better off without them.
Mm.
We can have a state which would where our cultural demands would be accepted. We would have no problem because we don't have to deal with these difficult these difficult characters who talk about this kind of syncretic culture and stuff like that. And we can have very much the thing. And of course, the other support was really from the left, which was you know I mean, I'm not inclined. I mean, well, Ambedkar's a rather peculiar character because I'm not sure you could really describe him as off the left because, I mean, in many ways he was fairly right wing, except for when it came to the
Mm.
interests and needs of his community, where he basically was very keen on having, positive discrimination or whatever,
Economic
for
discrimination.
policies for them. But otherwise, certainly he didn't think. But certainly the point was that, and of course Nehru, who was very keen. Even I think it was I think Nehru thought, well, perhaps this may be the best solution because he would not. It would be difficult for him to countenance a federal structure because he could not have the kind of central planning that he wanted
Mm.
to promote within the context of a federal structure, where basically the central government, the union government, would be vested with things like foreign affairs, defense, things like that,
Mm.
and wouldn't have as much control over the over the states, over the provinces, um, as was envisaged in the
Mm.
cabinet mission plan. So basically, you had a convergence of both these
Mm.
two important elements, um, and so and they were very. I mean, Gandhi to some extent was very did not want partition, but actually the trouble was that he really didn't. I mean, Gandhi had. I mean, his views in terms of political of how the country was to look. He was against the nation state. I mean, he had a great problem with because he saw a conventional state, which what people like Patel and people like Nehru were sort of were arguing for, as being basically swapping one form of tyranny for another. And therefore, in his view, his views were very inchoate. We were not sure what actually how that would actually work out. I mean, he had this notion of this village democracy and panchayats and so on. But the point is, there wasn't any clear thinking on that. But except that, I mean, he was certainly against this, and he was against the partition of Punjab and Bengal, for example. He felt that it would be because ultimately, even Jinnah, I think, in a sense, and I quote Professor Devji um, here, where when he, I think, writing it comes from his biography of Gandhi, which is a kind of intellectual biography. It says that, look, that both Jinnah and Nehru both secretly wanted a situation where Pakistan could possibly have a slight Hindu majority. you know, because if you look at it, the way Jinnah was acting in terms of
Mm.
wanting, of course, to keep the full this thing of Punjab, but also some of the princely states like Jodhpur, for example, very keen to have Jodhpur as a thing. And all right, Jodhpur had maybe a 15 or 20% Muslim minority, but it wasn't a substantial minority. But the point I'm making is that that also Jinnah was concerned about the future of the Muslim state, and maybe he thought having a large Hindu population would help the cause of secularism for the future.
So one of the because we need to talk about all
Yes,
the
of course.
worldviews that exist. And as I mentioned, the word name Venkat Dulipala, he wrote the book
Yes,
in which he's arguing
yes,
about the
yes,
quest for the new Medina is much before
yes, 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 yes,
1940s, and uh, people
yes,
like Aisha Jalal and others have argued that it's more like a a bargaining chip. But so to say, the way you are arguing that Nehru was somebody who would gamble, so gambling on such a big population
Jinnah, I
of
meant.
I, I'm
Yeah,
talking about then Jinnah in that
yes,
correlation, that
yes,
if Jinnah is doing the same,
yes,
taking
yes,
Muslims and the idea of a separate state as a bargaining chip, and then
yes,
then that actually ended up happening where the interest
yes,
of feudal elite Muslims is served more in the modern age Pakistan, and that led to an internal Muslim problem within India. And so,
yes,
so to speak, given the fact that as Hindu right and Congress were aware of the problems of minorities and issues and discourses and ideological differences, so to speak, Muslims were also aware.
of course.
Muslim League was a product of post 1905 Bengal partition.
Yes,
It understood the underpinnings of majority, minority, the change of demography,
yes,
power after the fall of the Bengal, Muslim sovereignty state. So, in that context, this demand, which created a Pakistan, so to say, which we are not going to focus on what happened to that, but it created a kind of a political situations for Muslims in India that was so unfair to them, and which was visibly part of Jinnah's gauge, that he sometime, I think, if I'm remember right, he also argued, if I have to give up some amount of Muslim sovereignty within a partition state in India, I would readily give it for a Muslim sovereign state. So in that context, how do you see that the Muslim problem emerged in India as a byproduct of both Muslim, Hindu right and the Muslim, feudal elites?
no, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think the point, at any rate, is that Venkat Dupalia, for example, does bring up. I mean, he, like me, I does center on the question of UP
Hmm.
as being one of the areas where there were this thing, and he refers to what there was undoubtedly an element of Muslim separatism. I mean, he particularly refers to people like Maulana Usmani and people like that, ideologues like that. So, so essentially, that is the thing. But the point which he seems to really, where he really doesn't, where he kind of not exactly suppresses, but I mean, he certainly doesn't deal with any great thing, is the attitude of the Hindu and of the Congress to the legitimate concerns of
Of the
Muslims.
Muslims.
He just doesn't deal with that. He
Hmm.
talks about Muslim, and you see, the interesting thing about the book is this, that it came out at a time when there was a kind of this whole clash of civilizational things were whatever had come
Hmm.
onto the scene. Huntingdon was Clash of Civilizations was
Hmm.
flavor of the month, and this whole issue of Muslims being aggressive and being difficult and being violent and prone to
Hmm.
jihad and so on. That these issues were this thing. So therefore, it became very fashionable for him to attack, to say, well, look, partition was this thing. But I mean, fundamentally, what I would also say something very, very simply is that a lot of this revolves around the elect. I mean, we have to remember that the 1935 Constitution gave only 14%. 14% was the electorate.
Hmm.
So we can't actually make out very clearly, whether there was a Muslim majority for partition by virtue of looking at elections. Certainly the 46 election, because the point is that things had been polarized at that stage and whatever. And the point is that, but anyway, what we are talking about is basically 14%. And the thing is this, that, and it is often the case, that people who are better off, people who are educated, um, maybe would be more inclined, particularly young graduates, for example, who would probably be very uncomfortable with getting, or would feel that there would be no scope for them for the sort of middle class in a Hindu India. That there was fear on the part of the Muslim middle classes. So a lot of the, say, more well-off Muslims who would be enfranchised played a disproportionate role in, say, for example, promoting the Pakistan thing or being members of the League or whatever. And they were not for religious reasons, they were for economic reasons. So there were a whole lot of factors, because it's very difficult, frankly, at a time of, for example, at a time of partition, when there was great polarization, there was great violence, there was discrimination, there was a sense of uncertainty and fear as to what the future held. And in such circumstances, people do make decisions, whether to cross the border or whatever, and you have to see that in a context. It's not an ideological choice, as simply as some people put it. I mean, someone like Patel, for example, kept saying that, for example, Muslims who have opted for Pakistan are somehow disloyal to India. But for example, if you were, I don't know, if you lived on the border of, you were a Myanmar Muslim, you were in Alwar or something, I mean, where you were actually, you were actually subject to violence. I mean, what would you do? You would go to cross the border, not because you necessarily had an ideological this thing for Pakistan, but because, and the same way that Hindus did. I mean, there were a lot of Hindus and Sikhs who left Punjab not because they wanted to, but because they felt that they would be subject to violence. So those questions are, they're all very unclear, but it's certainly not a simple issue of, how many Muslims, what was the case. I mean, certainly what we have, because you see what I think, and this is a point which I try to, is that the notion of giving Pakistan was seen by the Hindu right as something which was a huge gift to the Muslims. That having gifted them this great thing, then nothing else needs to be done. That basically all their needs were satisfied. And therefore, they can't really make any demands on society. And that, I think, is actually the most tragic thing. And it's something which has, frankly, bedeviled the Muslim question to the present day, because everyone has this crazy notion on the basis of what we don't know. Because, as I said, we don't know. We honestly don't know, and we will never know. What prompted such and such a family to cross the border, or was it a choice? And how many on what percentage of the Muslims were actually listening? Because remember, a lot of Muslims would just remained in their woods. For example, those living in Pakistan, Punjabis and Bengalis, remained in Pakistan. And the point is, there was no question of opting for Pakistan. That's where they lived, right? So we're talking about a very small percentage of people, about some 7 million or so, who actually left India for either the west part of Pakistan or the east part of Pakistan. But we're talking about 7 million people. And now the reasons why they went, we don't know. And, so there could be two factors, basically, which would have some, which would give us some clue as to the popularity of Pakistan among Indian Muslims. One was obviously the question of the elections, and that I think is really ridiculous, because on a 14% franchise, you can't really make out a case. And secondly, on the question of migration, there could be hundreds of reasons why people have left. I mean, which really have no. I mean, it could just be a fact that your brother went across, and you may not want to go. Like in my family, I mean, one of my uncles father's brother went across, but We didn't. But the point was that 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 we can't say with any certainty what the thing is. Now, if you have a situation where you're really not sure about why, about whether the Muslims wanted Pakistan, to assume that that Pakistan was somehow some great um, deliverance for the community, that it was some great gift, is absurd. Because I mean, why can you not see it by as a lot of the Hindu right see it? Well, look, good riddance to them. We don't want them. We don't want to compromise our politics. We don't want to compromise our culture. We don't want, you know, we don't want these people to have a say in the future of our society in any substantial way. And remember, it was largely succeeded because post 1947, what was the population? The population of Muslims in India was 11%. So it was a small, it was it had gone down, and that was largely not because of Muslims going to Pakistan, largely because the two majority provinces of Punjab and Bengal hosted the largest Muslim populations. So the point is that what we have then is this situation that it's that on any footing, this argument that the Muslims wanted Pakistan. Well, first, we don't know whether they wanted Pakistan, and the fact that they got Pakistan doesn't again mean very much, because the reality is that I think there was certainly, and as I said, there is this other aspect of the thing which we again don't talk very much about, and that is the notion that really it suited the Congress Party at that time for it to be for these states to be in a sense politically neutered, because it kind of guaranteed a Congress hegemony for it. Well, it certainly guaranteed a hegemony for 3 decades after independence.
So, because you mentioned about UP, and you mentioned about not just you. I mean, interestingly, Venkat, talking from a very different perspective, is also privileging what is happening within UP, and mostly what is getting partitioned is Bengal, is Punjab, but despite that, UP with a much more different, much more differentiated, intertwined, intermixed population of, so to speak, both Muslims and Hindus, with a long history of coexisting together. Why do you think that UP became this hotbed of, of course, one answer would be that it was closer to Delhi, in the sense that historically speaking, the power politics and the center of the way power and sovereignty were thought about was, so to speak, seated within this region in a sense. But then this argument that all of this is happening within UP, within the leadership of UP, both Muslims and Hindus alike, so to say, and then UP becomes the space of what we now call cow belt. So what was in UP in that context, in a way that necessitated, I mean, necessitated is a very harsh word, but then in hindsight, all of it happened. So what was happening within UP? What were people thinking? Of course, there was Maharashtra, there was Bengal, there was Punjab, but then this region became the, overarching organizing force of the Hindu right.
Yes, well, it was a very important state. It was important also for religious reasons. It was important in the sense that it was also as a state. And of course, now we're talking about the old United Provinces, which was minus Uttarakhand, which is largely a Brahmanical sort of
The
thing. But
Devbhumi.
at that time, the Brahmins had 12% were 12% of UP's population. Then you had the Kshatriyas, then you had the commercial classes, the Banyas. So you had a high caste, you had preponderance of high caste thing. You didn't have that, for example, the same way, for example, Bihar. You certainly didn't have that in the south. I mean, for example, in Tamil Nadu, the Brahmin population is about between 1 to 2%.
Mm.
Now, the point is the cultural aspect of this is very important because you had, the desire, for example, of the Brahmins to, to impose, for example, very Sanskritized, the Nagari script. You had the issue of cow slaughter. You had the issue of a general antagonism and Sanskritization of the population in order to get a sort of a majority. You had this whole majoritarian thing working at that stage because they felt they had a need to incorporate the lower castes as allies for them against the Muslims. And therefore, for example, to some extent, this whole business of beef had become a big issue in terms of, because it was obviously baiting the Muslims. It was trying to create a situation where so the point is that but and of course the point was that there was also a lot of cultural tropes and it was important things. I mean, of course you had, of course, the issue of Ayodhya, which of course did pre independence, and you had that altercations between Pant and Nehru about when that first incident happened, etc. You have, of course, Banaras, and you had Banaras Hindu University. You had Aligarh Muslim University on the other side. You had all these. You had various important madrasas and cultural thing of the Muslims, and similarly those of the Hindus. So the point was that and you had something which was, in a sense, something which was very irritating and troublesome for the Hindu elite at that time, or certainly the people like Malviya and Pant and Tandon and so on, was the fact that there was a tremendous the Muslims had a certain cultural had a great pride in a sort of, there was a Muslim cultural hegemony in UP, which simply because, and that was a shared thing. You had this what is called the syncretic culture, where Urdu was widely spoken, and a lot of the supporters of Urdu were, it crossed religious barriers, and it was something which was, I think, very offensive to a lot of the Hindu right. They felt that they should eradicate it. I mean, I even come to the example in my book, which was the most extraordinary examples, which I came across while researching the book, was the whole business of numbers. The fact that Arabic numbers were being used, which is what the numbers which we use today, offended them so much that they said that we must turn to some, Nagari numbers or Vedic numbers or whatever, but they didn't want to use them because of the Islamic provenance. So now, of course, that's not peculiar to UPM. That was used all over India. But the point about it was that there was a sense of humiliation, perhaps, that these people were sort of walking tall, that the culture and the tehzeeb and whatever else was there. I mean, there was something which certainly the Mughals left and was adopted by the populace in terms of everything. I mean, things like whether be from food to dress to whatever. I mean, there was a huge legacy, and it's a legacy which was they were intolerant of. And I think this whole point of tolerance, I think, is a key matter, because even today you see this level of intolerance on the part of, which I don't think is certainly, if we go historically, I mean, we don't find that. I mean, in, say, for example, the Mughals, for example, as a as a as a dynasty, were not, maybe with the exception of Aurangzeb to some extent, but that's that is very much contested.
Mm.
We're not intolerant people, but somehow there was this idea that, look, the only way we can recover our pride is by erasing a previous culture. And, and so therefore the attitude, I mean, for example, the attitude to Urdu was far worse in UP than it was in my state, in Maharashtra. I mean, in Maharashtra, we still had, Urdu schools and whatever, but
Mm.
that stopped in the 50s in UP.
Mm.
So I mean, so I
So,
think we have I mean, I don't know how well I've explained it, but I think that, given, as I said, the composition, given the culture, given all these factors,
mm.
that there was a desire to completely eradicate
Well,
that Muslim legacy.
for example, the most of the dimensions required for Hindu right civilizational glory to manifest in terms of the desire were more concentrated in UP, so to speak, as compared to other regions in India.
No, totally,
Uh,
totally.
while they were still present, of course, RSS is happening in Maharashtra. You have
Yes,
a Bengali communal history wherein the dominance of Hindu cultural and festivity
yes,
symbols
of course.
within the context of the national movement. But then
Yeah,
all of it is intersectionality of all of it is most concentrated in UP.
yes.
Also, you argue within your book about the fact that this is not just so to say civilization and cultural in terms of the claim, but it's also political and economic. And I would like you to focus on that argument also, how did the Hindu undivided family, how did the political nature of UP as a large state contributed to the expansion of.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, and it's a point which I never tire of laboring.
Hmm,
You see, because the thing is that, I by my political leanings are basically off the left. I mean,
hmm,
I do have this sense of not. I mean, I would consider myself some a socialist. One of the things I do find very irritating in our public discourse about the general Indian economy and the general Indian this thing is this notion of these Fabian socialists who seem to be um, people who seem to have destroyed or upset the Indian economic story.
hmm,
And one of the things which I find very curious is this, and I think there's a lot of what I call lazy thinking surrounding this point. I mean, because if you look at in the 50s, now the point is that, uh, you know, UP in a sense has to be held to account because UP was not only the largest state, it had a lot. It was it was a state totally dominated by the Congress throughout this period, and by a very right-wing Brahmanical kind of order, and and of course a lot of the UP congressmen, as indeed throughout the country,
hmm,
throughout North India anyway, were funded by the Marwari business communities, which
hmm,
were the Bajajis and the Birlas and whatever. And the point is that the HUF itself is a very interesting concept because it is a notion. It's the only notion. It's the only country in the world where you actually tax someone on the basis of the family, not on the basis of an individual, on their individual thing, but on the basis of the family. And also, the incident for the taxation comes at a time of division. It's not like a normal this thing. It's there. So basically, I mean, the Banchu Committee, which went into the whole thing of taxation of India in 1971, described it as a big tax dodge, whereby the Hindu business community were largely insulated from major taxation, both income tax, and at that time there was wealth tax and
hmm,
estate duty. So basically, the point is that certainly in the 1950s, you had a very strange situation where you had the three big sources of wealth, or people who had wealth, were the mercantile community, the royals, the Maharajas and the Nawabs and whatever, who were exempt from tax, and in fact, they drew the princely purses. And the third element were the agriculturalists. Now, again, UP and Bihar were big agricultural. The cow belt generally was largely agricultural, and you had large landholders. Now, of course, you did have land reforms, but those land reforms were very weak. I mean, they could have up to 40 acres, and then if you divided it among your various family, friends, and whatever, you could have substantial landholdings. Now, the point is, again, India is probably the only country in the world where you have zero tax on agricultural income without limit. Without limit. So the point is that if you were really a socialist sort of society, where did you get the monies, to distribute or to create public goods? You had no money. And this was, in a sense, a thing for stagnation. It was a recipe for stagnation. And my argument is that, this was a deliberate thing because, for example, you didn't find any interest in education. I mean, one of the things which should have been done. Now, of course, Nehru's blamed for that and said that Nehru, to be fair to him, at least as far as tertiary education, did do a good job. I mean, he set up all these IITs and IIMs and whatever. The point was that was for the good. But when it came to at the state level, it was pathetic. I mean, for example, one draws a parallel with, say, for example, Tamil Nadu, where you had Kamaraj, who introduced in the 50s, introduced the midday meal thing for children. That encouraged children to go to school. It also improved their nutrition. It was basically a very good thing. And the point is that now federalism as it existed at that stage, where the states had could draw upon resources which they raised, and weren't kind of crowded out with all these central schemes, could do that. But the point is, in UP, you had a situation of absolutely pathetic social indicators which continue to this day. I mean, so it's not that this thing, and therefore this argument about this so-called Fabian socialists who apparently were doing their best to the thing is just, frankly, a distraction. It's a distraction from the reality that a lot of the Hindu upper class had no interest in that development at all. And frankly, probably a lot of the Muslim upper class as well. I mean, whatever. I mean, not that they really had much of a say, but the Muslims were already becoming, under the spell of particular kind of, sort of thing. Muslims, I mean, to some extent were partly, there was some relief, I think, for them, in the sense that in the 70s, post certainly 74, you saw the Gulf opening up, and you saw a lot of opportunities for young Muslims to go, to work in the Gulf and make some money and do something. But basically, if we look at it, really speaking, the source of a lot of our, I think, stagnation has been the cow belt, because there was really no interest in developing and in educating people, improving their health, and bringing industry. Because the point is that what we've seen, certainly what we've seen very much from the 80s onwards, has been what is politically important are things like temples, are things like caste issues, in terms of particularly the OBCs, Mandal and so on. And we see these issues as being really very central to the political discourse, and not so much a desire on the part of people to have better public goods and public services. And I think that that is now that's quite different in the South. In the South, you do have, a constituency for that. Unfortunately, in North we don't, and the problem in the North it's not there. I mean, in Maharashtra, to some extent, there's always been Maharashtra's had a number of great social reform movements, in certainly 30s and 40s, 50s. Unfortunately, it's ended up with this Shiv Sena and these kind of particularist ideologies. But basically, what my argument is that we constantly use this excuse of the Fabian socialists, and because I say that, look, it is more than 35 years since we've gone through liberalization. Now, all the things which these people, a lot of the so-called economic reformists have sought, things like a better use land, better ability to acquire land, or for example, reforms in labor laws and things like that. That those things, the government has had a majority. Governments have had majorities. I mean, Mr. Modi himself has had several majorities. He's not done very much. I mean, he tried to bring in the agricultural things, but without any discussion and without any this thing. And it's like imposing a fiat, imposing some kind of firman or something. You can't bring in a law like that which affects so many millions of people. But the point I'm making is that the cow belt has been largely responsible for guiding the politics of the age of the political narrative. And what is clear in that political narrative is that it's not an ideologic battle between left and right. It's really a question. It's just really an issue between, a sort of, the needs of the Hindu right, which seem to dwell on things which are atavistic, things like temple politics and so on, and the politics of the cow and things like that, and of course conversions, and those seem to be the sort of the kind of issues, and of course part of them are generated from this whole majoritarianism thing, because if you look at conversions, it's rather like what the Western in the West, the right wing talk about the great replacement theory, idea that, for example, Europe is going to be Islamicized in the next couple of decades. I mean, despite the fact that, I mean, for example, in Britain, I think it's about 5 to 6% of the country is Muslim, are Muslims. But I mean, but anyway, in the same way, this conversion thing has this argument that somehow Muslims are going to overtake the Hindus in terms of the population, which is completely absurd.
So to say, if I'm following your argument right from the first theme. So the choice between liberty and equality, wherein liberty is taken as a priority because it's somewhere between liberty and equality that things were negotiated, but where liberty dominated against equality in which domains led to the structural nature of the state that was to be born, and which would lead to certain kinds of structures which were privileged, in a sense that it privileged the majority Hindu right narrative, and that Hindu right majority Brahminical framework from the cow belt, because it had the largest prime minister, so to say.
That's right.
Their interest was not the upliftment of not just Muslims, but generally speaking the country, from because that creates the reserve army of labor in graded realities, and in that Muslims were chosen as this enemy, which they knew before the partition also, that not all of India can be partitioned. It is what you need, a balanced population wherein you can structure majoritarian demands and structure a state based on that. And your argument is that within the UP, the culmination of this kind of politics with the kind of electoral power that this region had, so to speak, structured the polity as such. But then we fall back to the theme wherein the power was ultimately consolidated into the secular socialist Congress ecosystem, wherein all of this was read by Nehru and the others. They knew what Patel was thinking. They knew Hindu Mahasabha. They dealt with all of this. It was not as if these were newborn babies which had suddenly sprung
Yes,
out
of course.
after the partition. They were well aware of that politics. They were well aware,
Yes,
and they were they had dealt with that, so to
yes,
speak, that after 1937 election, they could see Muslim League and Hindu Mahasabha coming together to form a government
indeed.
for electoral reasons. But again, then we fall back to the commitments of Congress and Nehru to the ideological paradigmatic frameworks that they had proposed, socialism, equality, parity, fraternity, uh, secularism in that sense. And then you say that there is pseudo-secularism. So one, what do you mean by that? The commitment to secularism. And second, that within that smart positioning of secularism, what you argue was peddled is a certain interpretation of modernity and religion. Modernity and religion that discounts religious
Mm.
sentimentalities, but you
Yes,
cannot discount majority. You could only end up asymmetrically discounting the minority, which is the Muslim, which is the Sikh,
yes,
which is the
certainly.
other. And so Gandhi had a different view in terms of secularism. But how do you think the Congress led secularism, especially Nehru and after that, was compromised, and that led to the empowerment of the Hindu right, majoritarian ethno-nationalist civilizational politics that we
Yeah.
see as a structural outcome of it?
No, I mean, I think what happened, originally secularism was sold, was as a force which would obliterate. There was a distinction was made. Well, not a distinction, but the two will put at odds: secularism on the one hand and communalism on the other. And therefore, the idea of secularism was that it would stamp out differences. It would be something which essentially would create some sorts of sense of unity, and that was what secularism was about. It was meant because, and that was not unreasonable, because remember, this was all post partition, and partition we had seen, or at least according to the narrative, that Jinnah wanted Pakistan, and he was this thing. Now we are this thing. We are one. Therefore, the differences should be stamped out. That there should be some notion of unity. Accompanied with that was this notion that this idea of science being the center, or being a very important lodestar, that basically people should give up this, or people should not dwell in superstition and be mired in the past, and therefore in that sort of you know that kind of, the thing which I suppose in a sense religion brings along with it, a sort of sense of superstition and a sense of whatever. So so anyway, the thing is that if we look at Nehru in particular, I mean, he was certainly obviously concerned that uh, that that the Muslims have proper citizenship rights equal to those of Hindus, and when those rights were infringed, he was very upset about that, and he made it clear. But the problem was that he he was, I mean, for example, in UP, and the UP Congress was an autonomous body. They did what they liked. And in many ways, for example, the issue of Urdu, for example, was something which they really wanted to stamp out. And they wanted to ensure that it wasn't taught, it wasn't this thing. I mean, they ultimately came up with this three language formula, which had, Hindi, then Sanskrit, and then you had a choice between Urdu or English, which, I mean, for any Muslim who wanted to better themselves, they would have had to opt for
Choose
English
one.
rather than Urdu. So, so the point about it is that that in reality, this this secularism was not a real kind of did not really address some of the needs, because the problem was that there was the question of collective rights other than those of the Harijans, the scheduled castes and tribes, was really not extended to anyone else. I mean, I think other than the Anglo-Indians, which were kind of a microscopic minority, no one else had these rights, other than caste rights within the Hindu configuration. So, for example, if you were and that has become the big case in the last 20 years or 30 years, certainly since Mandal. You have had this whole desire for the upliftment of the OBCs. You see, and also protection also with the 103rd Amendment, where basically you provide a succor for the upper castes in this new configuration, because that is something, these are benefits which are on an economic basis, that if you earn less than, I don't know how much it is, I mean 8 lakhs a year or something like that, you get the benefit of 5 lakhs, something like that. You get the benefit of a particular quota. So basically the issue of group rights, and this is what I call is the real pseudo-secularism. The pseudo-secularism is that the Muslims are completely what you call it kind of marginalized, as far as I can see, as through any rights, apart from certain states like Kerala and so on, which does, and certainly West Bengal until recently, I think one of the first things they did was to deny certain rights to Muslims in terms of jobs and things. But basically, if you look at this whole issue of secularism, is that, Nehru said that, a caste-ridden society is not properly secular. And I think, the caste issue is the elephant in the room. We don't like to talk about it, but the point is, it is a situation where you give group rights, but within the Hindu configuration, the minorities are excluded.
341 that if somebody converts from Hindu
and
Dalit to Muslim or Christian
and if
Dalit,
you can convert from that, then you don't have the right to that. So therefore, basically the Hindus have to a large extent decided to take the full advantage of any of these kind of things. That's a consequence of the majoritarian thing. The minorities are excluded. The minorities, even cultural rights, are excluded. The question of so therefore we have a very strange sense of what secularism entails, because it certainly doesn't. The only thing which can be pointed out that somehow Muslims are the beneficiaries of is sort of Muslim personal law. But I'll come to that later. But the point is, that's about the only thing that Muslims have got something. But that's part of a wider tapestry of personal laws, which are not discussed. Like, for example, the HUF, which gives tangible benefits to
which
a
is also a personal
community.
law in
right.
Economic perspective.
Economic ways, that's right. But the point I'm making is that I don't, this talk about secularism necessarily being, good for Muslims. I mean, in theory, yes, but in practice, it's never been like that, because the problem is that now a lot of this, remember, was premised on the fact that we would be having a Supreme Court, which would be supposedly dispassionate and whatever in determining constitutional issues, enforcing secularism, etc., and civic rights. But the point is that has proved to be very disappointing. And a lot of the minorities, remember, who had rights in 49, in 48, 49, gave those rights up in separate electorates, things like that, on the basis that we are going to have a written constitution with judicial review. Now, having a written constitution with judicial review meant that these would be tangible rights which we could be enforced in the courts. But unfortunately, we've seen where that road has led to a bit of a dead end, really.
Mm. Interestingly, also, because you said secularism, pseudo-secularism, and secularism cannot be read without the compounding other, philosophical choices like
Mm,
pluralism, like, federalism, and so to
mm,
speak, so many else.
yes,
So secularism, in that sense, is a neutral container
yes,
until and unless is it liberal secularism, it's Gandhian
yes,
secularism, is it French
correct.
secularism, is it
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so in that sense, the secularism which intertwined with the understanding of modernity, so to
Yeah.
speak, in the Nehruvian fashion, wanted a certain kind of uniform civil code too. It's part of the directive principle, and for several different reasons, the Hindu right and some other groups wanted a certain kind of UCC in the longer run, assuming different kinds of justices. Somebody is thinking about teaching a lesson to the Muslims, but somebody else is thinking about, okay, pluralism, but ultimately we're going to homogenize the population in terms of how they act, maybe however they're believing, but you're enforcing law upon them such a way that they're forced to act in opposition to what they believe. So in that sense, UCC, how do you see it as a debate, given the fact that people, the Hindu right argue that the UCC has been imposed on us, but it's just a codification of the Hindu law, not impose uniformity over them. And there's a great debate about common law or uniform law. Uniform within what? Uniform between which groups? I mean, there's, so to speak, so many debates within that. But when it comes to the Muslim question, uniform civil code is seen in a certain way an appeasement to the Muslim minority, and in also another way a disenfranchisement of the women, of other groups within the Muslim community. And
Yeah.
how do you see this?
Well, I think this is just really. I mean, I think the point is the way it's been framed as appeasement to Muslims, which is really the most convenient way the Hindu right can posit it. The point is that, is it that way? Because if you look in at the time of the Constitution, the person who headed the Committee on Fundamental Rights
Hmm.
was Sardar Patel. Now, the point was the question of a uniform civil code came up there. I mean, people like Minu Masani and Amrit Kaur and all that were very keen on the imposition of a uniform civil code at that period of time. It was opposed violently by Patel, who in fact relegated the UCC to the directive principles. Now that was Patel, wasn't, and Patel was the least um, was a very Hindu politician. I mean, he's not animated by the concerns of the Muslims. I mean, he was not. There was not. He was not a Muslim appeaser. And the reason he did that was really for another reason, and that was the HUF. And that's not discussed,
Hmm.
because the point is that backers of people like Patel were the Bajajis and the Birlas and whatever. And the point was that if you had a uniform civil code, how were you going to treat co-parcenary property?
Hmm.
And
Like the
and
Sabrimala case also. I mean,
yes,
that's a
yes,
debate that is being put in the court, that essentiality itself is being, one way the Hindu right wants that essentiality test to happen on the Muslim minority, but because then that also gets,
correct.
utilized in their case, so then they say, okay, let's not have it at all.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, so
So,
so I think the point is that, because I mean, remember one thing, that the Shah, during the time of the Shah Banu case in 1986, 85, 86, At that time, a Hindu woman in a Kopasni family had no rights to any family property. She only got that right in 2005 when the Supreme Court ruled that she's entitled to have an equal share with her brother in that property. And we see the hypocrisy of the Hindu right, because they will shout from the hill, from the rooftops that look, and weep crocodile tears for the Muslim woman. But what about their own women? Because remember, that was the thing which scuttled Ambedkar's thing. Ambedkar in 1951, 52, tried to push through a reform of Hindu law. And in that, he had put in expressly that the Hindu girl child or woman would have as much rights as her brother in the HUF. And that was rejected. And in fact, I even quote in my book what I think Parsaka wrote of the minister who was Nehru's minister, who ultimately got it passed. And he said, that the notion of a woman having any rights in family property is unknown to Hindu law. So the point is that I want to put things also in perspective, that this idea that everyone was so animated by, I think a lot of these issues actually came up at the time of Shah Banu, and Shah Banu, and I think to my understanding, the Muslim personal law did a great injustice to the Muslims in that sense, in the sense that their obstinacy in terms of whatever, because I think the thing is that it did definitely lead to the and it was a very difficult case, because here it was quite a wealthy lawyer who was basically denying his wife of many decades, a very simple, a kind of thing, because at least my understanding is that there's no restriction on someone paying their wife. I mean, maybe under some view of law that, look, you can't, you should not pay more than that beyond India and so on. But I mean, honestly, I think the point is that
So particular
we
position
could have
that could have
we
been
could have we could have been a bit more sort of this thing, and not given the Hindu right the bone which they have been chewing on after that.
the meat of the discussion that you do in terms of in your book, that how is it that all of this liberty and equality and the choosing of liberty, how is it that it is transposing to the structure of state itself by devaluing federalism, which was something demanded by many, that the state, even though as a union, should have more rights at the federal level, wherein different positionalities can come from different demographic dividends, and so to speak, Muslims and other minorities alike can have some level of independent reasoning on how to move about in many ways in their own contexts, including politics, including economics. So, why do you think you've already argued that the overarching planning, requirement, or the planning mindset that Nehru had, which he thought federalism would, decompose, disaggregate too much for him to control? But how do you think that Ambedkar himself, the way the constitution was structured? For me, I'm not a law student. I'm somebody who's trained in philosophy, politics, and economics, and then moving to economics with extreme interest in philosophy. So I see it also as a question of philosophy of law. You have preamble, you have constituent, you have constitution, and then you have directive principles. The preamble has 10 terminologies that can be interpreted in any way you want from the ideological disposition you come from. So whichever majority takes up the state as in terms of sovereignty, they can reinterpret it, and that is happening. What is constitution is the result of constituent assembly debates, wherein whoever could argue and negotiate the best position possible they were able to negotiate, and Muslims frankly could not negotiate some of it, while they got a lot of it. And the directive principle is this overarching direction in which still there can be a mobilization that can be done to restructure the thought of constitution itself. In terms of philosophy, I see it like that. So in that context, how is Ambedkar, when you write, that it's a flexible constitution in a sense, and that flexibility could be utilized by majority.
Yeah, well, I think, certainly it is a flexible constitution. The problems, the problems basically really stem from, frankly, I think one of the big problems is that it's a constitution which is very much based on the Westminster model, in the sense that we have really no proper checks and balances. For example, we have an upper house, which is, as far as I can see, is completely and utterly redundant. It's a useless institution for placement and whatever. It doesn't really, I mean, other than this two-thirds majority thing, which is important for constitutional amendments, but it could have been used as like the Senate. It could have been used like the US Senate, for example, for the purpose of being a representation of the states and a check on government, on the executive, in the sense of a check on the lower house, on majoritarianism in that way. It wasn't. We have a great belief in all these ideas of conventions, where people are supposed to behave in a particular manner, like Badger, the conventions with Bagehot, Sir Walter Bagehot, who was a great constitutional writer of the 19th century, talks about. But now, I mean, if you look at the composition of most of these assemblies, which are sort of, where I think 60% of them generally, on average, have got criminal charges against them. And certainly quite a large percentage of them have even criminal convictions. Now, if you are talking about that kind of politician, I mean, these conventions are all very well when you have people. It's like that comment. It's like a gentleman's agreement. It's binding when it's between gentlemen, but if it's not, it's not. And the point here is that governors have to behave in a particular way and whatever. We've seen how governors behave. I mean, for example, I'm like shocked at, for example, the way that Ravi, Ravi in Tamil Nadu behaved in terms of sitting on acts, passed by a democratically elected legislature, and sitting on it for years without giving assent. Now that is something which is just simply would not be considered to be acceptable in any sort of democracy or any kind of federal structure. And yet, I mean, it was this kind of, the acts were struck down. Then the government went back to the Supreme Court for an opinion, and that was a wishy-washy opinion which suggested that the governor has the right to sit on things and so on. So, but what I'm saying is that, and of course we have 356, which has been the constant bane of our democracy, where we have the issue of governor suspending the elected assembly and taking on charge. Now there have been less cases of that, certainly since the Bommai judgment, but there have been cases, and the thing is that in most cases it's been done for political benefit. And of course we've got Article 3, which is very important because that deals with that led to the formation of the linguistic states. I mean, initially you had the state, Bombay state, which got divided between Maharashtra and Gujarat, and that was part of the flexibility of the constitution. But the point about the flexibility of the constitution is that there are powers where, for example, the central government can infringe upon the state list, which this government seems to do all the time. So basically, it's if you have a position where, and these are all parts, or these are all constitutionally correct things. I mean, the sense that there are powers within the constitution for the government to act like that. I mean, now, for example, we have the ridiculous thing in Kashmir, for example, where you have, a sort of a president, a permanent kind of president's rule. Um, and you have a thing, and ultimately you're going to end up in a situation. I think Pratap Banu Mehta said we're going to be a union of union states. I mean that ultimately there will be no democratic. So, you can have a very good, well written constitution, but ultimately the people who are in there, and the problem also is the Indian middle class. The Indian middle class. I think about a percentage, according to a Pew survey, showed that something like 85% of them are quite keen on military rule. Now, and certainly about 75% are very keen on an authoritarian rule. They have no problem with that. So we have this idea of this great leader. A great leader needs a centralized polity. He can't do without that. He like our present great leader, for example, has a great issue with state governments, and which are run by states which are in which are ruled over by opposition parties. He doesn't like the notion of he's very uncomfortable with the southern states because they don't vote for him and so on, or for his party. So the point is that in theory, you can say, well, we are going to have a flexible constitution, but the problem is that to also, there's just far too much flexibility, which has led to a situation of today, whereby basically federalism is really now it's a chimera. It's something which.
So coming back to the question of partition, what we've seen in the discussion we've had so far, that before the partition there were certain issues that were discussed, which was related to the demographic demands of different kind of communities who had different worldviews and different anxieties. And so what happened with the partition in the Indian context is the privileging of a majority psyche, although that itself in terms of caste consciousness is divided. But then the civilizational discourse of a Hindu unified nation from the Hindu side became a very unifying demand because of the post-partition conditionalities of the Muslim. So to
Yes.
see, so to say, when you said that the Hindu right, upper caste, upper class, elite
Yes.
were happy in saying that we've gifted the Muslims what they
Yes.
needed, but at the same time, they were letting their low caste know that this is a huge injustice that the Muslims have done to the Akhanda Bharata. So there were
Yes.
two kinds of narratives that the
Yes. Of
same
course.
lobby was utilizing. And in that context, you see, partition as, and others have also argued, as an unfinished business. The
Yes.
Pakistan question, that and every Muslim is either an infiltrator Bangladeshi or a
Yes.
elite
Yes.
Muslim trying to be a Pakistani, and
Yes.
the issue of Kashmir, the way it is portrayed. So there are two things that you've argued. One, the confessional failure of Pakistan itself towards its own minorities and the question of protection of minority. And the second is the externalization of the Muslim problem to from the Muslim state and the Islamic state perspective to a state that was supposedly born as a secular state wherein Hindus, Muslims in India were likely to live together peacefully. So there are two problems that you say that this partition created, and what we see today is also a lingering effect which would continue otherwise. How do you see that? Why do you say that it's an unfinished business? And of course, all of this vocabulary, not just in the Hindu right, even the way UAPA was structured, the way SIMI and other organizations were portrayed, even before the coming of the BJP government, the riots, the pogroms that have happened in India, so to speak, that has become the second nature of the Indian state in terms of the way partition happened.
Well, yes, I mean, I think the point here is that, and I think there's a lot of interweaving with this with Kashmir, because I think the problem is that Kashmir, and maybe to even a lesser extent Assam, because I would argue that essentially, if Muslims are seen as making demands as a community, the the Hindu right raised the specter of a second Pakistan. They see that particular thing as being uniquely divisive, and in a sense, it's kind of, it has some resonance with a lot of the Hindu middle class who are who've been drilled by this fact, who've been brainwashed by this whole argument that that the Muslims were sort of that the Muslims were privileged by being given Pakistan, and then and then look at them now today. They're making all these demands on us. Now the point is, a lot of those demands can be just arise from simply citizenship, from the very rights of citizenship. It's got nothing to do, because at the end of the day, you are looking at them through the prism of Muslims. I mean, it's not as if it's a one-way street. I mean, for example, you have something like, take for example something like the Enemy Property Act, which was passed in '68, which had a lot of a major impact on the wealthy Muslim classes, a lot of the people who had property, because the point is that affected, given the way our airship is structured, there would be some percentage of a enemy property element, perhaps in any property which was left behind. But the point is, it had a unique effect on Indian Muslims, as maybe a number of other laws. But basically, the point I'm making is that there is a narrative which is that Muslims cannot agitate for rights as Muslims, and that, because that is something which is going to be politically divisive. It is going to create a second Pakistan, and I mean, and that is the way that they seek to render these arguments or these demands illegitimate, that they are part of some desire to secede the country, secession or something like that. So that really is what is stated. So that you Muslims cannot, in that sense, agitate for things which have been named. I mean, but for example, caste elements can agitate for things they want in terms of, say, reservations or whatever. But Muslims are excluded from that, and that is the bizarre secularism which we have, where essentially Muslims are delegitimized. Except for the area of Muslim personal law, which, as I said, is a unique thing and is really much more related to the Hindu mercantile class and their desire to maintain the co-parsonry system than really any great desire for Muslims. You could remember that, so that.
Also, I mean, to conclude, in terms of our thematic, podcast, so this issue of delimitation that you've raised, and it feels like on a first pass a very different issue in terms of what is being discussed philosophically, an Indian Muslim problem, in terms of the way the certain kinds of philosophies and structures are privileged. But then you see delimitation in a particular way, in the sense that the way it is going to restructure territories itself is going to further. What happened in UP in the beginning is the proliferation of it in many ways, to the extent that absolute power and sovereignty can come to certain ideological positions that have already been gaining ground since the independence. And
Correct.
so in a particular way it would be reified and very difficult to undo. So in that sense, what is delimitation to you as an exercise? Of course, SIR is also happening,
Delimitation
other things
is,
are also happening.
yeah, delimitation is an extension of the cowbelt argument. It is an extension of the. You see, one of the problems, one of the interesting things about the whole issue of UP is the reason why it's never been divided. You know, there was the States Council of there was a States Council in the 1950s. I think I'm just trying to think of the particular name, but anyway, there was basically it was presided over by Pant, and it included on its committee K.M. Panikkar and Ambedkar, and they both argued. In fact, Ambedkar said in very clear terms that look, if UP is not divided into four, it will pose an existential threat to Indian democracy. That's what Ambedkar had said, and they were keen on dividing it four ways. And the point is, according to the various linguistic subgroups, which would have, in a sense, undermined Hindi in the sense that whatever, it would have undermined this whole Brahmanical thing. And I think in that sense, Ambedkar was correct. But the problem was that Pant was was very much a devotee of that principle of majoritarianism. Now, the point about it is that, and when I argue against majoritarianism, I say that look, the point about it is that because I have to I'm confronted with the argument that look, one man, one vote is a basic principle of democracy, and that if you deviate from that principle, you're not properly democratic. And it's a very strong argument. It's not an argument which can be wished away. But at the same time, the position is that we also need to have representation. And the same argument, as was apparent in the 1940s regarding the Muslims, has now resurfaced with relation to the North and South. In fact, there's a very interesting book, North and South, by a person called Neil Kant R.S., who's in fact a thing, and he refers to the cabinet mission plan in his book. He actually says that actually, if he had gone down that route, a federal route, India would be a much more distinct. But the point I'm making is that the same arguments that were there, which Nehru and company countered Jinnah, that we are the majority, that we can do, in a sense, what we want, is the same arguments you're finding today in the thing. And you have complications because the South contribute much more financially to the North than the other way around. In fact, the South subsidizes the North, to the point of at least 3,000 or 4,000 rupees, whatever thing per person. So, so you might end up in a situation where the South will be extremely, there'll be fissures, there will be schisms, there'll be problems. But the point is, and remember that this part of the country, they say, 1/3 of India grows at the rate of China. A lot of that is in the South. So the point is that you cannot get away from the fact that the South is significant, important, and the point is that, and they need representation, because otherwise your representation is going to be reified, the current representation, and that's not been good. It's not been good for the last 70 odd years. It won't be good for the future.
We just saw a CJP protest, and we saw Dharmendra Pradhan resigning. We also, within the Muslim side, we think about Congress returning and everything, which, any party which is going to have a more robust commitment to secularism is a necessity. But then also the Muslim question is revisited, that it is within that context that the Sachar committee report comes out, and that uh, in a way articulates the past 60 years of deprivation, the socio-economic issue, but in terms of the security issue that we have started facing after 2014, it appears to be a zero sum game, either this or that. And for Muslims today, it's the question of not zero sum game, it's the question of how to negotiate their identity and how to negotiate their fundamental rights that supposedly constitution has embedded for its citizen, and how to use that vocabulary or that framework, or to argue for more that has not yet been promised, in the sense that federalism should be strengthened, and certain rights that had been extended to other minorities should be extended to certain others, and the way the constitution had seen minorities like Dalits and others in the past 70 years, the demographic realities of others have changed, and they may have repositioned in terms of the structural disparities. So how do you see that the Indian Muslim question today? How should Muslims be taking up that in terms of discourse, in terms of demands, in terms of articulation?
Well, I think one thing is this, that there should be a sense also of Muslims building alliances. I mean, I think building alliances with the dispossessed, with the other dispossessed people. And I think the point is that there is a need to, I think, cut down or this thing on on what I call the Muslim particularisms. Things like maybe um, you know, we have this particular obsession with personal law, or we have this obsession with, you know, certain, maybe historical sites and whatever. With them, and I think the point is that what we have to face is that the Muslims are becoming steadily, are in fact second class citizens. And the point is, it's really a question of trying to, trying to develop, um, their citizenship rights. Now, how that can be done, it's a difficult question. But certainly, in political terms, I think the least we're held hostage to bodies like the Muslim Personal Law Board and so on, I think the better. I mean, I think the point is that, for example, in the South, it's quite remarkable how, you can see that, for example, that the Muslims have done better than they have in the North. And the point is that now, but it's again very difficult, because you look at the RSS ideology, where, and remember, education is a big function of this, this whole ideology, which the late and the much unlamented Mr. Pradhan was pursuing, was, something which the Muslims have to confront, because today, and remember, when we were talking about the Sacha Committee report, we were looking at economic benefits and how Muslims can have those kind of benefits. Today, I think it's really become an issue of security. I mean, more than, I would say, I think, some things are a bit of a non-starter. I think what we also have to understand is that, generally speaking, if we look at India as a whole, we see a lot of a lack of opportunities across the board. I mean, what was exciting about this whole cockroach uh, uh, Janta movement, party movement, was the fact that you had everyone together. You had some kind of unity or some kind of thing. And I think the point is that that I do feel that we have to that certainly security is absolutely vital, because I mean, even things of people being able to do their business, I mean, like I, the whole thing, businesses associated with the cows and whatever. But I think also there's a lot of scope for Indian Muslims themselves to try to improve their lot by simply a much more community um, centric um, projects and things, which you know should be access to, for example, access to finance and access to these kinds of things. I mean, I think we should, as a community, be perhaps less reliant on the state, because we can really see the state as being, other than maybe for basic security. But I'm looking at things like, for example, benefits and quotas and things like that. I'm really not so sure. I mean, I think it's very sad, for example, that this particular university in UP got demolished, because that was something which was set up, for to help in a largely Muslim dominated area. But I think educational institutions, uh, things of where the community can can try and access finance for small businesses and things like that, um, and and educational institutions. I mean, those are the sort of things. I mean, I'm not very clear, because it's not a very easy question, because the problem is that you know um, one is in an age where Muslims are unfortunately disparaged and denigrated, and it's not
Mhm.
just in India. I mean, it
It's a
seems to be a
global issue.
global phenomenon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Javed Gaya. Thank you for writing this book in a day and age where the identity itself is a crisis. It is very much important today that we also try to have our historical grounding on what happened, why it happened, who was responsible, what was our role, to be able to conceive, a reality which is a future-oriented, activity. So that can only happen when you know the structural realities that you are embedded within. And mostly that is what we have been disenfranchised with the false history, with the narratives of somebody this, that, Aurangzeb, rubbled temples to build mosques. So every potential mosque is a temple. So all of this is deeply rooted within the myth of history, and to untangle that history to see what was and what could have been and what should be is, I think, the first approach to building a future. So thank you very much for writing this book to make it much more clearer to a generation which has inherited a country which was otherwise relatively better than it is today. Now that does not mean that we had all the privileges. There was a battle in terms of our rights, negotiations, which should always continue, so that equality, parity, and right to dignity is always a goal which should be approached. So thank you, and I hope we
Well, thank you for
do.
having me, and allowing me some space to talk.
Thanks
Right.
a lot.
Thank you very much.
Exactly.
Thank you.